Two traders can start on the exact same day, with the exact same starting capital, reading the exact same books, and 5 years later, one of them is still trading and one of them isn't. It has almost nothing to do with who was smarter in year one. It has almost everything to do with something that doesn't even show up until year 3. And by the time most people notice it, it's already too late to fix. Every video about trader survival wants to give you a single dramatic reason: risk management, or psychology, or finding your edge. Those things matter, but they're not what actually determines who's still standing in year 5. What determines it is a slow, almost invisible divergence that happens across specific checkpoints. And if you don't know what to look for at each one, you won't see it happening to you until you're the one who didn't make it. So instead of a list of principles, I'm going to walk you through 5 years, checkpoint by checkpoint, following two traders who started on the same day, so you can see exactly where the split actually happens. Felix and Naomi opened their first live accounts within a week of each other. Felix came from a background in mechanical engineering, methodical, quantitatively sharp, the kind of person who reads a manual before assembling furniture. Naomi had spent 9 years managing a retail store. No technical background at all, comfortable with the mundane grind of a schedule, but with no particular claim to analytical brilliance. If you'd asked anyone who knew them at the start which one was more likely to still be trading 5 years later, almost everyone would have said Felix. Almost everyone would have been wrong. Year 1 looks almost identical for both of them, and that's exactly why it's the most misleading year to judge anyone by. Felix loses money in year 1, about $18,000 across 2 accounts. Naomi loses money too, roughly $11,000 across 1 account. Both of them make the same rookie mistakes. Both oversized positions after a win. Both revenge trade after a loss. Both of them, if you looked only at year 1, would appear to be on identical trajectories toward the same outcome, because year 1 financial results tell you almost nothing about who survives. Nearly everyone loses money in year 1. It is the least predictive year in the entire 5, and it's the year almost all trading content is obsessed with, because it's the most dramatic and the easiest to package into a video. It's worth being specific about why year 1 is such a poor predictor, because it isn't simply that both traders were still beginners. It's that year 1 losses are dominated by mistakes almost everyone makes on their way in, regardless of who they'll eventually become. Oversizing after a win, revenge trading after a loss, misreading normal volatility as a signal. These mistakes are so universal that they carry almost no diagnostic information about long-term outcome. A camera crew following Felix and Naomi through year 1 would have captured 2 nearly indistinguishable stories of early struggle. And anyone trying to predict from that footage alone which of them would still be trading in 5 years would have had roughly even odds of guessing correctly, which is to say, no real information at all. The actual split begins in year 2, and it doesn't show up in the P&L, it shows up in how each of them responds to a very specific event. The first time their strategy stops working for a sustained period, not because of a single bad trade, but because market conditions shifted underneath a system that used to perform well. For Felix, this happens around month 16, when a strategy built during a trending market meets 6 straight weeks of choppy, range-bound price action. For Naomi, it happens around month 15, for almost identical reasons. Both of them lose money during this stretch. Both of them feel the exact same panic, the sense that the thing that used to work has stopped working, and neither of them knows yet whether that's temporary or permanent. Felix's response is to rebuild. He scraps the strategy almost entirely and starts researching a new one, reading forum threads, backtesting different systems, looking for something built specifically to handle the conditions that just hurt him. This looks, from the outside, like diligence. It looks like exactly what a smart, careful person should do when something stops working. Naomi's response looks almost identical on the surface. She also adjusts her approach, but the difference is in what she actually changes. She doesn't throw out her core method. She adds one specific rule, a filter that reduces her position size during identifiably choppy conditions based on a volatility measure she'd been tracking anyway. One rule. Not a new strategy, a single adjustment to the existing one, based on exactly what the recent stretch had just taught her. This is the first real fork, and it's worth naming precisely why it matters so much. Felix's instinct, rebuild from scratch when something stops working, feels rational and thorough, but it resets the clock on every single piece of experience he'd accumulated in his first 16 months. Every strategy needs a real sample size to know if it works, and a real sample size takes months, sometimes years, of live execution to accumulate. By abandoning his system, Felix wasn't just changing his approach. He was discarding the only dataset large enough to eventually tell him anything true, and starting a new, smaller dataset from zero. Naomi's small, targeted adjustment kept her original dataset intact and simply refined it, which meant every month, going forward, continued to add to a body of evidence that was already accumulating, rather than starting the accumulation over again. It's worth pausing on why Felix's response felt so justified to him at the time, because understanding that is more useful than just labeling it a mistake in hindsight. When a strategy stops working, there are really only two possible explanations. Either the strategy has a genuine permanent flaw that market conditions just exposed, or the strategy is fine and simply experiencing a normal, expected losing stretch that every viable system goes through periodically. From inside the losing stretch, these two explanations feel identical. There is no dashboard that tells you which one you're in. The only way to actually find out is to keep running the system long enough that either it recovers, confirming the second explanation, or it continues failing across a genuinely large sample, confirming the first. Felix, like almost everyone in his position, couldn't tolerate the uncertainty of not knowing which explanation was true, and resolved that uncertainty the only way that felt immediately available to him, by assuming the worst and starting over. Naomi tolerated the same uncertainty for longer, not because she had more information than Felix did. She didn't. But because she'd decided in advance that 6 or 8 losing weeks inside a reasonable system wasn't evidence of anything yet, and she was willing to wait for a larger sample before drawing a conclusion, Felix drew almost immediately. By year 3, this fork has compounded into something much larger than it looked like at the time. Felix is on his third full strategy rebuild. Each one has looked promising for a few months before hitting its own version of the same problem, a market condition the strategy wasn't built to handle. And each time, his response has been the same. Scrap it, research something new, start over. He's not lazy, he's not undisciplined in the way most people mean that word. If anything, he's one of the most diligent researchers you'll ever meet in this space. But he has never accumulated more than about 5 months of continuous data on any single approach, which means he has never actually given any one system enough time to reveal whether it works across a full range of market conditions. He's been busy the entire time. He has almost nothing to show for it because busyness was never the actual constraint. Naomi, by year 3, is trading a version of her original method with 4 accumulated adjustments, each one added in response to a specific, identifiable weakness that showed up over enough repetitions to be trusted as real rather than as noise. Her results aren't dramatic. She's modestly profitable, nothing close to the kind of numbers that would make an exciting video thumbnail. But she has something Felix doesn't: a genuinely continuous 3-year dataset on a single evolving approach, which means she actually knows with real statistical confidence what her edge looks like across different conditions, because she's lived through those conditions with the same underlying system the entire time. Here's the part of this story that matters more than either of their financial results, and it's the actual mechanism I want you to take away from this video. Survival to year 5 isn't primarily a function of finding the right strategy. It's a function of accumulating enough continuous experience with any reasonable strategy that the experience itself becomes the edge. A mediocre strategy run consistently for 3 years with small refinements will teach you more about markets and about yourself than an excellent strategy abandoned after 5 months. Felix kept searching for a better starting point. Naomi kept building on the same starting point. The compounding difference between those two approaches is the entire reason one of them is still trading in year 5, and the other one is dangerously close to quitting by year 4. Year 4 is where the financial gap becomes impossible to ignore, but I want you to notice that the actual cause of the gap happened 2 years earlier, not in year 4 itself. Naomi's account has grown steadily, not spectacularly, but steadily, with a visible 3-year track record she can point to and trust. Felix, on his fourth rebuild strategy by now, is starting to show real signs of burnout that have nothing to do with a lack of effort, and everything to do with the exhaustion of never getting to see a payoff for the work he keeps doing. He described this period to people close to him as feeling like running the first mile of a marathon 4 separate times, always fresh, always motivated, and never once getting to feel what mile 20 feels like, because he kept restarting before he got there. This is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, because it's not really about strategy anymore. It's about what happens to a person's identity when effort keeps failing to produce results, and results keep failing to arrive for reasons that have nothing to do with how hard they're trying. Felix started, somewhere in year 4, to quietly wonder if he simply wasn't cut out for this, despite being, by any reasonable measure, more analytically capable than Naomi in almost every dimension you could test for. That thought, maybe I'm just not built for this, is the single most common thought right before a capable trader quits. And it is almost always the wrong diagnosis. Felix wasn't failing because he lacked the capability. He was failing because he never let any one body of evidence accumulate long enough to become trustworthy, which meant every year felt like starting over. And starting over 4 times in 4 years will exhaust almost anyone, regardless of their underlying skill. There's a specific irony in Felix's situation that's worth naming directly, because it's the same irony that traps a lot of genuinely talented people in this exact pattern. His analytical strength, the very thing that made him look like the more likely long-term survivor at the start, is precisely what fueled the cycle that eventually wore him down. A less capable researcher might have stuck with a mediocre strategy simply because they lacked the skill to construct a compelling case for replacing it. Felix's skill was good enough to always find a plausible, well-reasoned argument for why the next system would finally be the right one. That skill, which should have been an asset, became the exact mechanism that kept resetting his clock, because he was never short on reasons to start over. He was short on the willingness to sit with an unresolved system long enough to find out if starting over was actually necessary. By year 5, the split is complete, and it looks, from the outside, like a simple story about one trader being better than another. It isn't. Naomi is trading a mature version of a simple method she's now run continuously for 5 years, with a track record long enough that she trusts it the way you'd trust a habit you've done every day for half a decade. Felix quit trading altogether about 4 months before year 5. Not dramatically, not after some catastrophic loss, but quietly, the way most people actually quit, a slow accumulation of exhaustion finally crossing a threshold where continuing simply stopped feeling worth it. He went back to engineering work. He'll tell you, if you ask him honestly, that he doesn't think the market beat him. He thinks he never gave any single version of himself as a trader enough time to find out if it worked. And by the time he understood that, there wasn't much appetite left to start a 5th time. I want to be precise about what this means because it's easy to hear this story and draw the wrong lesson from it. The lesson isn't that you should never adjust your approach, or that Felix's instinct to research and improve was inherently bad. Adjusting is necessary. Naomi adjusted 4 separate times over 3 years. The difference is the scale and frequency of the adjustment. Naomi made surgical changes to an intact system based on specific accumulated evidence. Felix made wholesale replacements of the entire system based on the discomfort of a system temporarily underperforming. Before he'd given it anywhere near enough time to reveal whether the underperformance was permanent or just one predictable phase in a longer cycle. The skill that actually separates 5-year survivors from everyone else isn't the skill of finding a good strategy. Almost any reasonable strategy, given enough consistent repetition, will eventually reveal a workable edge or a clear, disqualifying flaw. The skill is tolerating the uncomfortable, uncertain middle stretch. The 6 choppy weeks, the flat quarter, the stretch where you genuinely don't know yet if what you're doing works, long enough for the evidence to actually arrive. There's a specific practical marker you can use to tell which pattern you're currently living inside, and I think it's more useful than almost anything else in this video. Look at your trading history and ask how many distinct, ground-up strategy changes you've made in the last 2 years. Not refinements to an existing approach, but genuine replacements of the whole method. If that number is 0 or 1, you're probably accumulating the kind of continuous evidence that eventually compounds into real confidence. If that number is 3 or more, you are very likely doing what Felix did, mistaking motion for progress, mistaking research for evidence, and quietly resetting your own clock every time discomfort convinces you the current approach must be the problem. It's worth being honest that this marker isn't a perfect diagnostic on its own, because there is a real version of Felix's path that would have been correct. If a strategy has a genuine structural flaw, if it depended on a market condition that has permanently ended or relies on an inefficiency that's been arbitraged away, then rebuilding really is the right call, and sticking with it out of stubbornness would be its own kind of mistake. The skill isn't blind persistence, it's the ability to tell the difference between a system that's fundamentally broken and a system that's simply going through the discomfort every viable system periodically goes through. The honest answer is that this distinction is hard to make from inside a losing stretch, which is exactly why it has to be made in advance, using a rule you set before the losing stretch arrived, rather than a judgment you make while you're in the middle of it and desperate for relief. Naomi's rule roughly was that she wouldn't consider a full rebuild until she had at least a year of continuous underperformance relative to a clear, predefined benchmark. Felix had no equivalent rule, which meant every uncomfortable stretch became, in the moment, a fresh referendum on whether the whole approach was worth continuing. I think the hardest part of this entire pattern is that Felix's behavior looked like the responsible choice at every single step along the way. Nobody watching him in real time would have called him reckless or lazy. He was doing exactly what a diligent, analytical person is trained to do when something stops working: investigate, improve, rebuild. The tragedy of his 5 years isn't that he made an obviously bad decision. It's that he made a series of individually reasonable decisions that, compounded together, prevented the one thing that actually determined survival from ever having a chance to happen. Enough continuous time inside a single evolving system for real evidence to accumulate. Naomi's 5 years look, from the outside, almost boring by comparison. Same core method the whole time. Small adjustments, made slowly, based on real repetitions rather than discomfort. No dramatic pivot, no exciting rebuild story. Nothing that would make for a compelling highlight reel. That's exactly the point. The traders who make it to year 5 and beyond rarely have an exciting story to tell about how they got there, because the actual mechanism of survival is closer to geological than dramatic. Small, consistent, barely visible layers accumulating over a long enough timescale that the result eventually becomes undeniable, long after the process itself stopped being interesting to watch. It's worth asking, honestly, what would have had to be different for Felix to end up where Naomi did? Because the answer is smaller and less dramatic than most people expect. He didn't need a better strategy. His first strategy, given the same 3 years of patient refinement Naomi gave hers, may well have turned out fine. There's no way to know now precisely because he never let it run that long. He didn't need more capital, more discipline in the moralistic sense, or more market knowledge, all of which he already had in abundance, compared to Naomi. What he needed was a single rule, decided in advance, about how much continuous underperformance he'd tolerate before concluding a system was actually broken rather than merely uncomfortable. That one missing rule is the entire 5-year story, compressed into a sentence, and it's the kind of thing that's almost invisible until you're looking directly at two people who started on the same day. So if you're somewhere in your first few years right now, wondering whether you have what it takes to still be doing this in year 5, I'd ask you to look past the question of whether your strategy is good enough, because that question, on its own, is far less predictive than you think. Ask instead whether you're giving any single approach enough continuous time to actually prove or disprove itself, or whether every uncomfortable stretch is quietly convincing you to start over before the evidence has had a real chance to arrive. Felix and Naomi started with the same capital, the same books, and by most measures, Felix had the sharper mind. The thing that determined who was still trading in year 5 wasn't in either of their heads on day 1. It showed up in year 2 in a choice that looked almost identical from the outside and diverged completely in what it actually did to the 5 years that followed.